Okay. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight at the Des Moines Public Library virtual. Tonight we are joined by Sean Donaldson from the African American Museum of Iowa, and he is going to give us a wonderful presentation on the history of Juneteenth, emancipation, how it's currently being celebrated, how it's been celebrated in the past, and if you've not known much about Juneteenth beforehand, this is going to be a great way for you to get your feet wet in that. If you have just a few housekeeping things, be sure to keep your cameras off and your microphones off. Please make liberal use of the chat function though, along the bottom. If you have any issues finding it, just raise your hand and I'll message you privately. Um, if you have any questions for Sean or for me, definitely pop them in the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it on over to you, Sean.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Rebecca. Thanks to you and the library for having me/the museum today to talk about Juneteenth. I'm excited to be here. I'm just going to get my screen shared real quick, and we will jump in here. Okay, one last little tweak, and we should be good to go. Okay, so before we jump in, I do want to give a quick introduction to the African American Museum of Iowa for all of you. The African American Museum of Iowa was founded in 1993 by a small group of members of the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church in Cedar Rapids, who noticed that African American history and culture were underrepresented in school curriculums and who decided to take action to ensure that their stories would live on. What began as a collection in a church building eventually grew to exhibitions in a local shopping mall storefront. And then in 2003, after a capital campaign and some new construction, our permanent home, which you see on your screen, was constructed right on the river in Cedar Rapids. And that is where we continue to work today. One note I want to make about what you see on your screen: our usual hours are Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., but we are still on reduced hours for COVID. So Thursday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., we are welcoming visitors in our space. And to stay up to date on all of those sorts of things, you can visit us at blackiowa.org. The museum is guided by its mission to preserve, exhibit, and teach the African American heritage of Iowa. We keep a collection of several thousand documents and artifacts that we take care of and make sure they live for the future. And we use those to tell the very important stories they're part of through exhibits. At any one point in time, the AAMI has 2 exhibits on display. Our permanent exhibit, Endless Possibilities, which looks at the broad African American history narrative focused on Iowa stories, and a temporary gallery that usually changes annually. Right now, it's housing an exhibit called Unwavering 21st Century Activism that looks at social movements today related to race, gender, sexual orientation, and more. And then finally, we teach this in a variety of ways, through programs like this one, through guided tours of our exhibits, through classroom resources, to traveling displays that we send all over the state and country. There are many ways we do that. And again, to stay up to date on all those things, you can check us out at blackiowa.org. But today, we are here to talk about Juneteenth. And Juneteenth is truly a momentous occasion that many people have been remembering for hundreds of years, but is finally starting to see some growth nationally to some recognition that it probably should have had for a long time. But to really appreciate Juneteenth, we have to understand what Juneteenth and emancipation come out of. And so we are going to dive into some of the difficult history around slavery on our way to our appreciation of Juneteenth. And so to do that, we're going to jump all the way back to 1619. Of course, 1619, we've heard a lot lately with the 1619 Project, and that's because in 1619, a group of people who had come from Africa as captives were brought to Jamestown, Virginia. And this is really the time we see the foundation of slavery in the United States created. There had been enslaved people in the United States previously, under the Spanish in the Southwest, for instance, but this is a time when the English settlers bring in enslaved people for the first time. What's interesting about this is right from the get-go, we see a certain moral dilemma with what's happening here, because a number of those people brought in on this first boat are identified as indentured servants. And of course, indentured servitude at this time was kind of a popular thing amongst young European men. It was this idea that they would sign over a number of years of their life, usually something like 7 years, and in exchange for 7 years of unpaid work, they would get passage to the New World, they would get training and experience working the land, and then at the end, they would get a plot of land all their own. So when this first group of enslaved people are forced to Jamestown and they're identified as indentured servants on manifests, that shows us that people maybe aren't totally comfortable acknowledging what this system is. But next to their term, instead of 7 years, it identified that their term was life. And it wouldn't take long before the colonists get a little bit more comfortable with this idea. By 1641, Massachusetts has laws that define who is considered enslaved. By 1705, Virginia has its own set of laws indicating that anyone imported from a non-Christian native or from a Native American population is considered enslaved. And we also start to see colonies outlawing slavery in the early 1700s. In 1735, the first colony does this. And so take a minute in your head and kind of guess what colony might be the first one to outlaw slavery. And now I'll give you the answer. It was actually Georgia in 1735 that does this. And what's interesting is that for Georgia, it was not a moral issue or a human rights issue. It was actually a fear of rebellion. Of course, at that time, Florida was occupied by the Spanish, and there was fear amongst Georgians that the Spanish would invade. And when they did, enslaved people in Georgia would rise up and join them. And so Georgia chooses to temporarily outlaw slavery. But the question is, why did the colonies turn to slavery in the first place? And there's kind of a three-part answer to this. Number one is that England has just moved its major economic focus across an ocean. And that major economic focus was agriculture based, so it needed a lot of labor to do this. And at first, that was a really exciting adventure for people who had the opportunity to travel overseas and take on this work. But that first round of people who take on this adventure face some challenges. There's a really high mortality rate from disease and from lack of food. And there's also a fear of other people who already reside in North America. And so these three things start to really chase off the adventurous spirit in people who might otherwise have been new arrivals to fill some of those places. And so then Europeans who have connected with African populations and decided, of course, we know this is not true, but at that time, Europeans decide that African people must be less than them. And so they create this narrative that African people need help, need to adapt to European culture. And again, we know that these are horribly misguided ideas, but that's what the Europeans begin on. And they see a chance to combine all of these things. We have all this work that needs to be done, and no one wants to do it. And these other people that we think we're supposed to guide to our way of life. And so they think they can do all of those things while making more of a profit by bringing enslaved people to the New World to do this work. Now, it starts slowly over time, and there's a dehumanizing process that we know happens through this. And by the American Revolution in the 1770s, we know that African Americans are fully viewed as property by both the British and the colonists. In fact, during the Revolutionary War, both armies offered enslaved people their freedom should they choose to take up arms and fight for that respective side. And so this, of course, validates the status of property, because you can't be freed if you aren't property in the first place. When the war came to an end, the colonists have won. Not all of those promises on either side were kept to those people who had volunteered their service. And then, as the U.S. founded itself and drafted a constitution, the colonists were, of course, very focused on a fear of big government. And out of fear of big government, they prevented the federal government from doing a number of things. And one of the things they expressly prohibited the federal government from doing was prohibiting slavery in any state, or building provisions, and they also chose to, I should say, build provisions that made it so that anyone who tried to escape from slavery would be returned to the enslaver, as opposed to allowed to live a free life. So this is built into this document that today we often view as the cornerstone of freedom, right? And so that shows us some challenging things about this status as well. Now, from the adoption of the Constitution and then into and throughout the 1800s, there's much debate over this concept of racial slavery. As the United States expands, discussion over how to balance the government between those who held slaves and those who did not hold slaves became a really heated discussion, and it led to several attempts at compromise. In fact, there were 7 attempts at legislation, at least, between 1793 and 1860, and 6 of those succeeded on a federal level. But with each compromise, the issue only grew more contentious. In fact, in the 1850s alone, violence broke out multiple times in the Senate and the House chambers. On the floor of our government, we see outright violence, culminating in an all-out brawl on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1858 in a debate over California. You can see a sketch rendering of that from a newspaper from 1858 on your screen. By the bitterly divided election of 1860, it was clear that our nation was divided and war was soon to follow. Now, following the election of 1860, we know 11 slaveholding states of the South chose to remove themselves from the United States to form what would be called the Confederate States of America. Today, we often hear this described as a war over economics or a war over states' rights. But when we look at the declarations of secession, which were documents that each of the southern states wrote announcing to the federal government that they were leaving, they all mention slavery as the reason they're doing this. Mississippi's is on your screen, and its second sentence very clearly says, quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world," end quote. And so the fact that we have this argument today, it's sometimes a little bit mind-boggling when you go back and read the documents that this really was going to be a war over slavery. Even more interesting, though, is that after the Confederate States make these declarations where they identify slavery as so important to their way of life, when it came time to draft a constitution for the Confederacy, the decision was made to ban the importation of further people from Africa. But again, this was not a moral choice. Instead, it was an attempt at a compromise so that border states or northern states might join the Confederacy and give them a better chance. It also did not outlaw slavery in the South. It simply meant that enslavers would have to rely on racial slavery by birth as opposed to by importing new people from Africa to maintain the supply of enslaved people. Now, when fighting broke out, it was thought that the Civil War would be quick. No one wanted the country to be at war against itself very long. No one thought the country could sustain fighting itself for very long, but the war did drag on. The first shots were fired in 1861. We know that the war doesn't end until 1865. And in 1863, Abraham Lincoln's kind of tired of waiting for this war to figure itself out. And so what he does is he tries to make a push to end this conflict, to give him a chance to turn the tide. And up until that point, Lincoln and the US government had been pretty careful to avoid tying the Civil War to the issue of slavery because they were trying to hold on to those border states that had slavery but had joined and stayed with the Union when the country split. But in 1863, Lincoln sees too much of an opportunity to continue to avoid making this about slavery. And so, of course, on January 1, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, over time, some of us remember, or maybe we're taught, that the Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved people in the United States. But what it actually did was free enslaved people in territories of rebellion. So, in other words, Lincoln emancipated those who had been enslaved in southern states. What's tricky about that is that the people in the southern states viewed the Confederate States of America to be their government. They weren't listening to Lincoln. They didn't think he was their president. And so the Emancipation Proclamation, while it would eventually set up great change, wouldn't have an effect until the Union Army had a chance to get into different places in the South. What it did help do, though, was set up our society for General Order number 143, which the United States War Department makes, and it allows for the enlistment of African American men in the military for the first time. Even though African American soldiers fought all the way back to the Revolution, this is the first time they get signed up officially and paid for their service, even though it wasn't equal and it was still segregated. But even in the face of those obstacles, hundreds of thousands of African American men answer the call and make the Civil War a fight not only about unifying the United States, but also about freedom and civil rights for African Americans. As enlistment numbers grew, so too did Union victories. And the more territory the U.S. took, thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, the more freed people there were. In 1865, the Civil War comes to an end when the Army of Northern Virginia surrenders in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. And this signals the end of the conflict, but it doesn't immediately bring the two countries back together. What happens is this very slow-moving communication where the news has to be shared and the people in various places have to react to that news or be forced to react to that news in certain ways. And so in the Deep South, when the Civil War comes to an end, it's shortly thereafter that slavery is brought to an end, but not everyone gets that word right away, especially in places that hadn't yet met the Union Army. And that's because individual enslavers chose to withhold that news from the people who they had been enslaving. And that's something that we should really dwell on for a second, because oftentimes we think about slavery as this very giant institution, right? When we watch movies and we see depictions of this, we see very large plantations with lots of land and many, many people held in bondage on that land. But in actuality, the average U.S. enslaver held between 5 and 8 people. So that means there are families of 4 and 5 and 6 who are keeping somewhere between 5 and 8 people enslaved on their land. And that's far more personal than we're used to thinking about this. Now, there were people who had massive swaths of land. Of course, George Washington, at one point at Mount Vernon, holds 300 enslaved people. But this smaller system makes it kind of difficult to chew on when we think about people withholding this news from those they were enslaving. Even still, that's what happens. And it takes months before everyone receives this news. So until the Union Army occupies an area and enforces the Emancipation Proclamation, nothing changes. And so though surrender had occurred in April of 1865, it isn't until June 19th that Union soldiers led by Major General Gordon Granger make their way into Galveston, Texas, with news that the war had ended and that the enslaved were now free. Note that this is 2.5 years after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. So this Emancipation Proclamation really had little impact on Texas until General Granger and his men arrive. When they get there, Union forces are finally strong enough to influence and overcome the enslavers, even in the southernmost places in Texas. One of General Granger's first orders of business when he gets here was to read to the people General Order Number 3. And it began with the words, quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and free laborer," end quote. The reactions to this news ranged greatly. Some people were in pure shock. Some people fell into immediate jubilation. Some chose to linger and find out what this new employer-employee relationship was going to be all about. Others felt like their best way to grab this freedom was to leave immediately, to hit the road. Some people headed north to where they felt they might have freer or fairer lives. Others headed east towards other southern states in hopes of reconnecting with loved ones that may have been left behind somewhere along the way. And so we see people going all of these different places and setting up new homes. But settling into these new areas as free men and women brought on different realities and different challenges than people were already used to persevering through. And so recounting the memories of Juneteenth and its festivities and this great moment of elation starts to serve as a motivation and a release from the growing pressures encountered in these new lives that people were beginning to set up. And so the celebration of June 19th, or the anniversary of Gordon Granger's announcement, gets coined Juneteenth, and participation grows pretty rapidly in early years. The Juneteenth celebration becomes a time for reassuring one another, for praying, and for gathering remaining family members. And it gets revered for decades, especially in Texas. In fact, many people who had formerly been enslaved there make pilgrimages back to Texas to celebrate Juneteenth. And a range of activities were provided at these early celebrations, many of which continue in tradition today. Things like rodeos, like fishing, like big barbecues and baseball were just a few of the typical Juneteenth activities one might have found. But Juneteenth at its core was always focused on education and self-improvement. So it was common for elders or guest speakers to be called upon to recount the events of the past and the lessons they had learned. Of course, within that, prayer services were a major part as well. And there were certain foods that become popular and synonymous with Juneteenth. Strawberry-flavored things become very popular, just one example. But even more traditional was a giant barbecue. Many Juneteenth participants would bring something. Everyone would bring something. And because of this, there were special dishes everywhere with things that weren't always available year-round. This was the chance to eat special food, things like lamb that wasn't around all the time. And a true Juneteenth celebration left visitors kind of stuffed and with enough conversation to last until the next. But another very important part of these early Juneteenth celebrations is pictured on your screen. What people wore was very important. Something that doesn't get talked about a lot in history today is that during the era of slavery, there were laws in place in a lot of Southern communities that dictated what enslaved people could or could not wear. That was meant to separate them in status, to make them appear less than, right? And so in the initial days of Emancipation celebration, many people who had formerly been enslaved bought or took fancy clothes when they left the land they had been enslaved upon, and they wore their Sunday best to show their new status, to actively put on display their freedom, as it were. And so that became a very important part of all this as well. Now, in the early years, there weren't a lot of people besides the African American community who cared or participated in these celebrations. In some cases, some communities did put up a fight over groups of people using public spaces to celebrate Juneteenth. And so instead, most people found their way to rural areas where there weren't many people to intervene, and where there was plenty of outdoor space for people to get involved in all of those outdoor activities like horseback riding and fishing that we mentioned before. One of the common places where this happens is on church grounds, but eventually, as African Americans grow their wealth and become landowners, they begin to donate land and dedicate land for Juneteenth festivities. And one of the earliest documented land purchases we see is when Reverend Jack Yates spends $1,000 to purchase Emancipation Park in Houston, Texas. Not long after that, in Mexia, Texas, the local Juneteenth organization purchased a park that they called the Booker T. Washington Park. And that became a Juneteenth celebration site in 1898. There are accounts of Juneteenth activities being interrupted or halted by white landowners in the early days when those landowners were trying to force laborers to return to work. But it seems that most people allowed workers the day off, and some even helped support these celebrations with food or with economic assistance. And so for decades, the celebrations grew and flourished. In Booker T. Washington Park in Mexia, as many as 20,000 African Americans flowed through during the course of the week to celebrate Juneteenth. But over time, Juneteenth would fade. Economic and cultural forces provide for a decline in Juneteenth activities and participation beginning in the early 1900s. As people migrated to new cities, classroom and textbook education took the place of traditional home and family taught education. In addition, people began to work new jobs in packing plants or mines or on the railroad. Classroom textbooks talked about the Emancipation Proclamation or Independence Day as celebrations of independence, but said little or nothing about Juneteenth. Workers were already given a holiday for July 4th, and employers were uninterested in giving another day so close. Then the Depression only furthered this, driving more people off of farmland and into urban environments to face these same issues. And so, unless Juneteenth fell on a weekend or a holiday, there weren't very many participants available to do the celebrating. But over time, a change in cultural norms and a rise in patriotism would steer Juneteenth back towards the rise. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s yielded both positive and negative results for Juneteenth, but really kicked off a rise back up for Juneteenth. It pulled many of the young African American participants away from Juneteenth celebrations and into the struggle for racial equality, but many of those involved in the struggle for racial equality linked their struggles to the historic struggles of their ancestors. This was evidenced in many cases, but one specific example was when student demonstrators involved in the Atlanta Civil Rights Campaign in the early 1860s donned Juneteenth freedom buttons for their activism efforts. Again, in 1968, Juneteenth starts to see a resurgence as well. This was spurred on by the Poor People's March to Washington, D.C. Reverend Ralph Abernathy's call for people of all races, creeds, economic levels, and professions to come to Washington and show support for the poor brought many people who might not otherwise be spending time together from many different backgrounds all into one place. And activists wearing Juneteenth buttons or celebrating Juneteenth were able to spread that word to the people around them. This took Juneteenth celebrations to new places all over the country. In fact, two of the largest Juneteenth celebrations are founded after this march, and those are now held in Milwaukee, which you see pictured on your screen, and in Minneapolis. But not all states are in a hurry to take this on in any sort of official capacity. In fact, the first state to officially recognize Juneteenth was Texas, but Texas didn't do so until 1980. We know Iowans have been celebrating since at least as early as 1990, though we think it was sooner than that. But Juneteenth was not recognized as an official day of recognition in Iowa until 2002, when Governor Tom Vilsack officially recognized it. When that happened in 2002, Iowa was the 7th state to officially recognize Juneteenth and one of only a few that legally designated an observance day. In Iowa, our day of observance is the 3rd Saturday in June, which this year is actually Juneteenth proper. Today, far more states recognize Juneteenth, and we see more striving to do so, as well as the federal government periodically attempting to do so. And we now see cities making these proclamations as well. Notably, this year, both Iowa City and Des Moines have announced that that will be an official city holiday. So that is a good change that we see happening. And today, Juneteenth celebrations look a lot like festivals that we see for other occasions. They're still oftentimes centered on education efforts and self-improvement, but they include all the things we're used to seeing, be it food vendors or fun and games or music performances or dances or fashion shows or parades. All of those things are worked in many ways. And we see more and more institutions getting involved. Large institutions like the Smithsonian or the Henry Ford Museum have begun sponsoring Juneteenth-centered activities. We see small organizations that focus just on Juneteenth. We see different community centers and libraries and museums taking on this work, and it's been great to see this growth happen. This year, there are a number of opportunities in Iowa where you can get involved with Juneteenth celebrations. On your screen on the left, you see the Iowa Juneteenth Observance that's happening in and around Des Moines largely. You can see their list of events which kick off this Saturday and last all the way through next week. And on the right side of your screen, you can see what the museum has going on, which also kicks off this Saturday, the 12th, and lasts throughout the entirety of the week, culminating in an in-person festival in Cedar Rapids. And so there's lots of ways to get involved and to go out and celebrate true emancipation from the era of racial slavery in the United States. We also see celebrations far beyond Des Moines and Cedar Rapids and Iowa City. Though COVID has made things difficult over the last couple of years, in 2019, there were celebrations in Ames and in Coralville and Davenport and Dubuque and Waterloo and more. So they're all over our state. Juneteenth today celebrates African American freedom and achievement while encouraging continuous self-development and respect for all cultures. As it takes on a more national, symbolic, and even global perspective, the events of 1865 in Texas are not forgotten, but instead see a growth in recognition. Because, of course, emancipation in its truest form in the United States stems from that moment. And the future of Juneteenth looks bright as we see all of these organizations continue to take on an opportunity to celebrate, to commemorate, and to remember the struggles that led to Juneteenth and the importance of that moment on June 19th in 1865. And so with that, I will say thank you for tuning in and listening and digging into the history of slavery and Juneteenth with me a little bit. At this time, I will happily do my best to answer any questions that may have been sparked in your mind as we worked through that information.
Yeah, so if you have questions for Sean, go ahead and pop them in the chat now. So Sean, one question that I have is, what kind of primary documentation do we have regarding Juneteenth observations here in Iowa?
Sure. So we're lucky enough in Iowa that pretty much the vast majority of Juneteenth observance that we know that happened under committees' watchful eyes. Committees, of course, are popular today, but they've been popular for hundreds of years in how to get things done. And so the records that they keep, minutes from their meetings, notes that they take, are a lot of where we get this information, as well as letters back and forth from people who are working on putting these things together. So that's a lot of how we know that this is happening on the whole nationally, but as well as in Iowa, we have a fair amount of notes from some of the folks that do this.
Okay, cool. And are those on display at the museum?
They're not on display at our museum, but I think the State Historical Society may have some of those on display.
Okay, awesome. We'll have to all go check that out. We have another question here. There are 3 states that do not recognize Juneteenth as a holiday. Which ones?
That is a great question. Off the top of my head, I don't know that I have that answer readily available. Wait, that is not entirely true. I know one of them, I think, I'm not promising that this information is 100% accurate, but I'm pretty sure that Oklahoma is one of them, and I think Hawaii is one of them. But I don't know beyond that. So I may have to answer that one in an email later, but I'm happy to do
Okay. Yeah, I will include the full answer in my follow-up that we get from Sean tomorrow. Um, so Deb and Todd, you have your hand raised. If you have a question, would you mind popping it into the chat? It is down along the bottom of your screen.
I also got a question just to me, it looks like.
Okay, yeah.
And that question says, is there a national organizing effort or association for celebrating Juneteenth?
Mhm.
And as far as I know, there is no national overarching organization of the celebration of Juneteenth. There are many different organizations at all sorts of levels that take on their own Juneteenth celebrations, and many of those impact other ones. You'll see, like, for instance, we've inched our way towards a week-long celebration at the African American Museum, which is because around the country, other folks have been pushing towards that week-long celebration. It's great to be able to do that kind of commemoration. But in general, we're all kind of watching each other as they happen and learning from each other and putting on our own events, but there's no coordinated, cohesive national thing yet.
Okay. We have another really interesting question. Did Confederate state slave owners or owners of enslaved people move their enslaved to Texas?
That's a very good, very complicated question. Texas has a really interesting relationship with everything around it for a very long time in the 1800s and before. Texas is kind of part of Mexico, but it doesn't really want to be part of Mexico because Mexico is against slavery. So then Texas is kind of in the United States, but Texas isn't really sure it wants to be in the United States. And it's not the first to jump into the Confederacy either. So Texas is always kind of taking it slow, but they're always identifying their interests with slavery. So I don't know that I have any proven examples of people taking themselves up and moving to Texas to continue slavery. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were some people who did that. But something that's important to remember to kind of contextualize that is as we near the end of the Civil War, the South gets really economically devastated. There are blockades preventing business from going in and out of the coastal ports. The Union Army marches through many places of the South and quite literally burns things to the ground. And so a lot of the wealth that is built up to perpetuate this system is destroyed in the truest sense during the Civil War. And so to have the wealth to pack up everything and enslave people and move to a new state and start over is probably not something too many people did from a purely economically logistics perspective.
Interesting. Yeah, it looks like we have time for a few more questions. If you have any, go ahead and pop them in the chat. And if not, DMPL has many more opportunities for you to learn about Juneteenth. There is a list of books that I sent you earlier that you can check out from DMPL, and I have more if you go through all of those. It is also linked to the event page, as well as a list of other events, the Iowa Juneteenth observation list that Sean showed, we also have available on there. And in the chat, you can go to dmpl.org/Juneteenth to check out an interactive timeline, a bunch of other fun lists, see a few other interesting presentations that are going to be happening. We are going to have Juneteenth take and makes going on in the next couple of weeks. On Tuesday, the 15th, we have an excellent program that is at the bottom of your form that I sent out to y'all. And it is going to start at 7 p.m. It's going to be on Zoom as well, about the Heartland Black Panthers, with some of the original founding members. So I highly suggest that you sign up for that one. It's going to be really cool. If any of you have any questions or anything like that, please don't hesitate to ask. Tomorrow you will be getting a link with the YouTube video and just a repeat of all of those resources that I shared. But on behalf of myself, DMPL, and I'm sure all of our participants, thank you very much, Sean, for such a great presentation.
And thank you again to you and DMPL and to all of you for being here and for having me today. I really appreciate it.